Welcome to Communion and Shalom.
In this podcast, we are exploring how the biblical and historic Christian faith can engage sexuality, ethnicity, culture, and our local communities as we pursue the flourishing of God's kingdom. Our goal is to engage these topics charitably and with nuance.
Hello, everybody. This is David Frank here today with special guest Brendan Johnson, D. Brendan Johnson.
Hello.
Brendan, thank you so much for joining today. Brendan and I have been housemates recently and are co-conspirators in trying to, follow Jesus and figure out how we can be doing that better and better in this world as Christians. Today, we are going down a fun road, hitting into kind of the third area that we want to go into as a podcast, really thinking about the flourishing of our local communities and how we think about that with respect to, how does our faith inform that? How does, as we follow Jesus, does that drive us into connecting to, contributing to our local communities? And so the topic is the commons, and maybe we'll get into cooperatives too, but we're just going to start with the commons. Brendan, can you briefly explain what we mean by the commons and how you first got interested in that idea?
Yes, definitely. And thank you so much for having me on the podcast and continuing some of our late night conversations that do not go on the podcast as well. So the commons is something that has become very important to me and I think has been very important in our history as Christians and as speakers of the English language, because, we see this word actually all the time. Like downtown in the Twin Cities where we live, there's a commons that's right outside of the major football stadium. There's all sorts of commons. You'll see commons this, commons that. But it's this funny word because we don't really have a good sense for what it means. And if you were to ask somebody what it means, it sounds just kind of like a nice word. But it actually has a very specific and rooted definition that comes from history. And so there's a little bit of a history lesson that goes along with all of this. And if you look back, for example, at European history, although this has been all over the world, not only in Europe, but also in Southeast Asia, across Africa. But we'll take the kind of example of English land use changes throughout the last 1,000 or so years. So before the kind of monarchy and the big landowners started to control all the land, the way that the land in an English village would have been arranged and used was on a very cooperative basis. And so pretty much what would happen is that every year the people would come together to decide, who was going to farm what land. Maybe you had good land last year, and so you're going to have bad land this year, or vice versa. Everything was divvied up. Some people, like for the church or for the lord of the manor, would have their own domain that would be for their, use. But the majority of it was really for the community's use. And so there were the system called the open field system, where everybody had their plots of land. And then there was also this land called the commons. And the commons was this communally stewarded good, this resource that helped to meet a basic need for people. So maybe you were too poor to have a whole herd of cows for milking on your own, but you had 2 cows and you would put them out in the commons and they would graze together with the rest of the villagers' cows. And then one person would be in charge of being kind of the cow herd for the day, watching over the cows. And at the end of the day, you would bring the cow home, milk the cow, and then the next day bring it back to the commons. There would also be place for growing vegetables and so on. And this idea of the commons actually was institutionalized as far back as the 13th century. And if you remember from your history classes, the Magna Carta, which was this big declaration signed by the English king in I think the early 1200s, there was something called the rights of the forest, which went along with that. And that's a lot less well known today, but it was extremely important at the time because it said that the forests also were the commons. And so you had certain rights as a commoner, right, to go into the forest, to take, enough wood to help rebuild your house, to build a wagon. Now you couldn't cut down the woods and sell them all for your private, profit, as it were. but you had a certain like use right to these woods by virtue of just being a commoner and being somebody from that area, being part of somebody who stewarded that altogether. So as we think about the commons, that's really what we think about. It's this kind of decommodified, which is to say it's not really like buying and selling. It doesn't have like a monetary value that's easily attached to it. So it's decommodified. It meets a certain good, things that you need for your daily living. And it's also outside of the domain of either the state, like the king in this case, or the market and the like large landowners who are treating land as a commodity and buying and selling. So the commons, when we think about it, it's kind of against state and market power, as it were. And it's kind of the democratic form of power. Is that helpful?
Yeah. Yeah. Can you distinguish what's the difference between like something held in commons versus the public park?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. So the difference between public and common would be to say that fundamentally the public is really kind of a subsidiary idea that goes under the state. So back, when everything was owned by the king, technically, that was kind of public land, but it was really a private possession of the king. So then when there were all these democratic revolutions where we said, okay, no more kings, now we're going to have the sovereign citizen in place of the king, and like the democratic and republican assemblies that are going to make our decisions. That's the new kind of sovereign body. So the control of some of those public spaces then went under the domain of the state. Now, if things go well, the democratic state and the commons can be pretty close to each other. But there are just a whole bunch of kind of perversions of the state form where the state becomes, not accountable to the citizens, or it has its own priorities and like excludes certain citizens from use. So, and even under the best circumstances, there's still quite a bit of lag time or like a distance between citizens who want to be involved in public life and the decision making through all the park boards and elected officials and so on that finally gets to say what happens in a park. So a park is public to the extent that it's kind of like owned by the democratic state, and small d democratic just meaning like, run by the voters, as it were. But that's very different than the commons, which is much more like directly managed and can be in opposition to the state.
So I'm thinking of a park nearby, let's say Powderhorn Park. If that were held in common instead of held by the public government situation, what would be different? How would things move differently?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, I think part of it is that a public park, meets certain goods, like the good of recreation, being in nature, and so on. But even the form of kind of city park in and of itself is kind of a creation of the modern nation state. So I'm not even sure that that's the best example. Like, it wouldn't be easy to turn into a commons. But another example, like a city forest, like in Atlanta right now, there's a certain city forest that's being kind of taken over by something called Cop City. You guys can all Google that. And they're going to tear down this public forest. But it's a place that people go for recreation, and they also get certain, ability to access the forest and like the goods of the forest in a more direct way. And it's less of like a park, quote unquote. But even there, again, I think it's still legally a park. So I'm not sure. And part of the issue, too, is that we really have very few forms of commons in our land use today. Now, we actually have a lot of different commons, because if you can imagine taking this land use example and kind of abstracting it, there's different forms of commons all over the world. A great example of this is like Wikipedia. So Wikipedia is something that gives you direct access to this online encyclopedia. It's run directly by the users and interested people who make the edits, create the articles and all that. And it meets the basic need of like information and reliable information. And so that's a really good example of the commons, I think. And again, just to reiterate, part of the issue is that a lot of the actual land commons were taken away and they were privatized. So just to kind of open another chapter about that, the process of privatizing the commons is what was historically called enclosing the commons, or the process of enclosure. So you had this like common land in the village, and then the wealthy landowner or the king would come along and kind of take it for their own use. They would put up fences. So that's literally what enclosure meant. And then they would graze their sheep and their cattle on it and kick off all the villagers. And in some cases, historically, like get rid of the whole town to take the entire land. And then the villagers had to like go into the cities to work into the factories. And that's what gives you this, these stories in Charles Dickens of like these terrible industrial cities filled with smog. And like, where did the people come from? Well, they came from these villages that were kind of getting violently enclosed by especially the sheep industry at that time. And they needed a lot of land for the sheep. So they just kicked the villagers off, took the whole thing. And it's a way of turning like common wealth into private wealth, as it were. That's the process of enclosure.
Okay, so yeah, I just looked up enclosure movement. It was a push in the 1700s and 1800s. Yeah, just as you described, taking away land that was formerly owned in common by members of like a village, and then taken to the public for grazing animals, changing it to privately owned land, or land that was more available to the public for grazing animals, growing food, using it whatever they needed to in their kind of local village situation, and moving it into privatization for the growth of industry. And so 1700s, I was recently kind of looking over into, coming from a Presbyterian Reformed denomination, looking through the Westminster Confession, like, are there any hooks in our confessional document for like practical economic discipleship and following Jesus? And it's structured where they actually go through the 10 Commandments and they try to start applying the 10 Commandments in more detail. It's not just like, okay, don't murder, but it's also like, okay, don't hold grudges against people. Don't like be hateful. And I think it was, like not coveting your neighbor's possessions. I should have pulled this up beforehand, but whatever commandment that is, specifically they said, unjust enclosures are not allowed. And it also had something about like moving a boundary marker as well.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
And so it was, like in our modern English, we're like, what's an unjust enclosure? Because in our current context, everything's already been enclosed. We can't even imagine like what it would be to have a piece of land that like the closest we could get is if some like property owner next to a park started like taking a piece of the park and like expanded their fence and was like, hey, no, this is now my yard. And we'd be like saying, oh, he's stealing parkland, and adding it to his house land.
Yeah.
But in reality, it was like not just parkland that's managed through the park system, but truly just like, no, that's for our whole village. That's for the community, and you have now claimed this as your own. And that's it's just it's taken me so long to try to like imagine. Do you know, so like this is largely the European context. Do you know any about what this history has looked like in other societies?
Yeah, I know mostly about the English example just because that's the one that's most easy for English speakers, especially because a lot of this, our roots of it in modern English, like we have linguistic roots that go into history, even if we don't really recognize like where they come from. For example, with the whole thing about commons or even enclosures, as you were mentioning, like we don't know what that means today. So I know for sure that it was happening in multiple European countries, France, Germany for sure. I was also reading a really wonderful paper from 2009 that was talking about the Ethiopian context. And they were saying at least until the 70s, if not later, there was still commons land management happening with like dairy and agriculture. Also in Bali has a famous example as well as like the rice irrigation system and the temple complexes and the kind of how the liturgical year matched up with the water regulation and in the kind of ecological year, and how that was democratically managed to get enough water to everybody on this kind of volcanic island.
Could we backtrack and go to how did you first even get interested in digging up this, unfortunately, kind of historical idea of the commons and why what's led you to get connected to it now?
Right. I think part of it is a little bit of like, interest in how can we build like a more beautiful life together, especially because a lot of the kind of political offerings, I feel like, at least in American politics, it's like left and right both have their dead ends. And so people kind of also say, well, maybe it's somewhere in the middle. But that doesn't feel very fulfilling either. It's like, well, we need some really new, innovative ideas for like, how can we build, what Luke Brotherton talks about as the common life, right? And that's when I started, that was kind of the spur in some sense. The other spur was thinking about the idea of the common good. Because especially as Christians, this is something that we talk about all the time. And this goes back to, every major, Catholic social teaching talks about it. Thomas Aquinas talks about it. The Protestants talk about it. It goes all the way back into Greek philosophy with these specific ideas, the common good, the common good. And the common good, at least in the Catholic tradition I know is defined, is like some sort of good container that in which individuals find their good. And it's not exactly the good of the individual, but it is good for the individual. Like it has this kind of enabling function, but it functions on this community level, right? So the common good. And I was always confused or somewhat frustrated because I felt like we were all talking about this idea of the common good all the time. It's a very powerful idea, but there was no teeth to it. It's like, well, what does this mean? Especially because we see so much kind of fast and slow forms of violence in the world today that are forms of sin against the common good, but because the idea of the common good doesn't have any kind of conceptual teeth to like describing what it even means for most people most of the time, we kind of can't describe the attacks on the common good. So, I mean, one example that's happening just right now in the UK is that they have the National Health Service, which has been a huge point of pride for post-war England. This extremely egalitarian system that's lean, that's efficient, that's a point of pride for the doctors, for the patients, for the nurses, for everybody. And so this would be public, not common, let's say. But it has been being privatized. It's being kind of financially starved by the government, which has some kind of philosophical problems with a system like this. So it's a whole thing called austerity, where they're essentially starving the NHS, and then the NHS is starting to crack under the strain. And then people are saying, well, this isn't working. We should bring in private companies. They're more efficient. So, but it's all kind of manufactured at the same time. So that's an example, I would say, is like an attack on the common good, because the people who are most vulnerable, especially, are going to be the first ones who are harmed by the system. People, if suddenly you have to start paying for your healthcare, it's the poor who are going to go without healthcare first, right? And I come from a healthcare background, so that's kind of the context that I often try to read things through. But that's an attack on the common good in a pretty direct way. But a lot of people who talk about the common good from the Christian perspective seem to not describe it in that way. So I guess all of this is just to say I got frustrated with this idea of the common good that is divorced from any real kind of teeth or conceptual meat on the bone, if you will. And then I discovered this kind of idea of the commons and started to have the hunch that like the common good is actually the good of the commons, if that makes sense.
So that rather than it just being like, oh, let's pursue the common good, let's have merely, like good virtues or good ideas, or as individuals we contribute in maybe like a volunteerism towards other individuals in society. It's saying, what are the institutions or resources that we're building that we actually all have a common stake in, that we have a shared ownership or a shared belonging to, and that as we build up that, whatever, the example may be, then it is automatically like unfolding its like blessings out to the, it is actually quite directly a common good. Would this be an example? Air quality is like, we've been able to privatize land, a major resource, and water less so. I think water might be another kind of like common resource that is, though people do maybe, but we can jump to water maybe later. But air, for obvious reasons, is something that it would be difficult for people to kind of privatize. Maybe they buy a bunch of land and put windmills on it, and I don't know if that inhibits or whatever like the wind resources of a neighboring community. But as someone, obviously, like if a toxic polluter is using that land to distribute their toxins to get it off of their property, out of their waste, it is a common common evil, a common harm, a common pollutant that affects everybody nearby. But if someone is planting, forests in order to bring about air quality improvements, it is automatically blessing everybody with that common air quality improvement, better breathing, better health conditions that come about because of that. And
yeah,
so like air seems to be like a really, what's that one movie where they start selling air because it's all bad? It's a cartoon.
Maybe I haven't seen it.
The Lorax for the
Lorax.
Trees. And there's this funny bit where, the guy's just like, don't trust them. The real air is dirty in the world. You need to buy my air. And it is just this like, people maybe one day will try to privatize air. And I mean, actually already in our neighborhood, we have a lot of people getting improved air filters for the homes because of how much air pollution there is in our neighborhood, the increased asthma rates. So something I think that when commons aren't defended, they become taken granted for. And there's roundabout ways, and probably air and water are the big ways that we're like, oh yeah, we have air and water. And slowly they get like polluted, and we're like, and we forget to think that, we actually had a right to that. Like we all, because we're so individualistically minded, we are like, it's hard for us to know that we have a right to it because we think that we only have rights to what we own individually.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think your idea about the common good being tied into like the natural world is very important. Like we could really describe, the water and that part of the ecosystem as a common good. The air as an ecosystem is a part of the common good. Even the birds and the bees and the trees and just like all these different parts are part of some sort of like natural commons. And I think that's really powerful too, because again, just to go back to the kind of non-commodified aspect of the common good, like you can't really buy or sell those things, or you shouldn't be able to, right? And I think this is another part too, because at least, something we've talked a lot about is kind of the Anglo-settler culture pushing westward and kind of this long centuries of violence against our indigenous brothers and sisters who have a very different notion of a relationship with the land and relationship with creation, right? And I think that we're using kind of like European historical language for the commons, but I think it's very in alignment with an indigenous worldview in that sense, because like, again, like a village commons, you can't really buy or sell that. How could you buy or sell that? And it's seen as this like very evil thing to try to privatize and turn it into a sellable commodity. But yeah, the whole world in some sense is like a gift. It's a form of wealth and gifting and blessing for everyone that should be kind of shared by everyone. And so it's really an abuse of that gift to like turn it into something saleable. And also even to the point, you made a great point that like clean water and clean air is something that we should consider like a human right. But you could imagine a world where like, let's say clean water is a human right, which I would affirm. But do you get clean water because your ecosystem is clean and there's just bountiful water and it's just a beautiful part of the world around you? Or are you getting shipped in water in Aquafina bottles and 24 packs to your doorstep every day? You have the same amount of water, let's say, but one of them is being supplied through kind of a privatized good in a degraded ecosystem that can't provide clean water anymore. So you're still like, quote unquote, fulfilling the right to clean water every day. But the comments pushes us a little bit further and says like, what is the whole ecosystem doing? What is in the biggest picture? It's not just about me and my individual access to like a certain amount of clean water every day, but also the larger creational context that we find ourselves in. There was somebody whose name is Gerard Winstanley, who's from the 17th century, maybe about the same time as the reformers who you were talking about. But he has this great quote. So he says, "The earth, which was made to be a common treasury of relief for all, both for beasts and men, was hedged into enclosures by the teachers and rulers, and the others were made servants and slaves. Take note that England is not a free people till the poor that have no land have a free allowance to dig and labor the commons, so as to live as comfortably as the landlords who live in the enclosures."
That, as I was been thinking about this idea of the commons, and then being like, oh, the word commoners. You know, I would used to hear, oh, commoners, that's just like plain folk, simple folk, is derived from people who had their livelihoods based on the commons. They didn't have their own enclosures to say, this is my property land, but they were able to exist as a group of people, the commoners, who were able to get the wood they needed for fire or for, you know, putting up a dwelling place from their common resource, or able to take out their couple sheep out to the common field and get what they needed. And then, so as I look at it's part of I'm in such tension when I see my homeless neighbors, and I'm grieving off the fact that there's so little, like, they're here in the city because they can get resources from other people or maybe from some nonprofits, but there's really no commons available to them. We can't say, oh, you know, hey, like, you need something, you need go into the forest and find some berries for your food. Go do some things for your own livelihood. But no, there's just nothing. It's either, you know, gift or get a job, and there can be just a whole set of reasons for why getting a normal job is difficult and unsustainable for someone who's on the streets.
Yeah, and I love that too. You know, some people talk about this like new poverty, or this kind of, what is poverty today, and how is that kind of a different kind of poverty than there was in the past? And so, like, let's say take a commoner from 500 years ago versus a homeless person today. Like, those are very different states, because as a commoner, like, you actually do have land, like, and you do have an ability to feed yourself. Even if you're the poorest person in the village, you don't have a big house, you don't have anything except a little place to lay your head at night, but you still have access to the commons. And that's like a real good that can provide you subsistence, versus somebody who's totally homeless today, like they have nothing. And so that's the other thing of, like, the commons is especially good for the most vulnerable, because it provides like the daily needs and wants for people who otherwise don't have enough money to like access those things privately and are able to like privately pay for them.
And even those who do have property, you know, you have a small little lot in the city, and when you're like, okay, yeah, you have to work to get your capital in order to pay for the home and the tax, you know, and taxes for it and insurance. That's all like good until you get to the point where, like, what if you're elderly and you're just trying to like exist? You know, you're not you've purchased the home, it's paid down. You're not trying to like build a new estate, and you're no longer able to work a full-time job or maybe even a part-time job, but the city taxes keep rising, and the amount of commodity, you know, like, you have to have so much access to capital just to exist. Whereas in the kind of commons thing, a lot of your resources were, as you said, decommodified. You could go directly to, if you needed some wood to patch a hole on your house, you could go to the woods and get that wood. Now you have to go to Home Depot, buy the probably, you know, much better quality wood, or if you need it, there's just a lot more systems you have to be engaged with, and there's no direct access for people to be able to provide for themselves even. And so there's this narrative of, oh, you know, the people who are trying to make stuff public and shared, they don't want to give agency to the individual person. You know, they just, people are being taken care of by the state. The commons is actually an infrastructure where both persons, families, households, communities have more agency to have more direct access to do the work and provide for themselves. But now we've made it so that you have to actually be embedded in a lot of different systems in order to, quote unquote, provide for yourself. You have to fit a kind of narrow mold of the industrial worker.
Yeah. The person who has access to dollars, because dollars are how you get access to housing, dollars are how you get access to healthcare, dollars are how you get access to food. Whereas, you know, a form of life that would be based in the commons, you'd be able to get access to a place to sleep. You'd be able to get access to healthcare. You'd be able to have access to food in a mostly decommodified way. So the amount of actual dollar, like you're
If
still
you wanted
doing work,
luxuries, you still needed some
Right.
dollars.
Exactly. And that's a much more traditional form of life. And I think people were probably happier. And it's not that commons, again, with the Wikipedia example, it's not that commons are like old fashioned, right? I mean, this is like a present day joy to have access to Wikipedia. And we could make many forms of life like that.
A fun quote, you probably introduced this to me, but I think it's pretty popular in the commons world. It's about the goose and the commons.
Yes.
It goes as such. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from the common, but lets the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose.
Mm-hmm.
And if we jump back to the natural commons that we don't think about because they're either so common to us, so normal for us, like air, or water. Often going, yes, we have the big rivers, but we also have groundwater that is incredibly important for the existence of like everything living. And there's been huge settlements from 3M, big company, everyone gets their tape, is a Minnesota-based company. And there is a large settlement. Well, there's a lot of probably settlements that have happened with 3M, but particularly in Woodbury area where their headquarters are, there's been like 14 different East Metro communities that have basically their water's been toxified. Like people can't put a land in well into their own land anymore and pull out water that was good. And so now 3M has paid for, they've bought up land to create water filtration systems where people are now getting water piped from the filtration system or water filtration plant directly to homes. And then so that's the public water system that 3M is having to pay for to create more filtration for it. And then anyone who has a private well, 3M has been providing them privatized filtration, point of entry filtration systems for their own homes. So okay, a little bit of justice has, I guess, happened that 3M is now at least subsidizing or paying for the ability for people to get what was always due to them, right? Like that's kind of the argument for why this is happening. But it's crazy that we even allowed this to happen, and for how often companies aren't actually really paying the consequences full. And it's and the understanding is this water, this groundwater is ours. It's our common natural resource, and you don't get the right to take that away.
And let's describe it in the form of the commons, because one form that you could describe that would be to say that 3M polluted, it harms the common good, right? And now we need to do things to kind of clean up this beautiful land that was destroyed, or the water system. But the way of describing it through the lens of the commons would be to say that 3M, through their kind of overly lax production process of whatever toxic chemicals that they were making, spilled it. They had very lax regulations for their own production, and by doing so drove down the cost, drove up their profit in the end. So they essentially stole natural wealth. They stole from the natural commons to put more money in their own pockets, right? So that was a form of enclosure of the natural commons for 3M's revenues and stock prices. And when you get rid of the commons, you have to meet that through either private or public solutions, right? So that's what 3M's having to subsidize, either private well filtration systems or public provision. But still, like a poisoned natural commons with like a filter on everybody's wells is like a worse overall system than just like a clean system, a clean ecosystem that we didn't destroy in the first place.
Yeah, who knows what that's doing to every other natural living thing outside
Exactly.
of
There's so many knocked out. Everything's connected, right?
Oh, man. There's this excellent book called Small is Beautiful, and they talk about just a lot of, relationship to natural resources of industries that are taking advantage of the natural resources, like a river, and it's like tons of water's coming by, and they never they never think back, what's my responsibility to the river? It's just like, oh, I have to pay for the pipe that gets me I can pump in the water from the river, even if it's like billions of gallons a year. And my cost is only the pipe. And I'm not thinking about what do I need to be doing back to steward the river from which I'm benefiting as a company.
Right.
So yes, companies should be thinking that way, but I think part of that reason that we've lost that sense of responsibility back is because we've not been practicing it in these small normal ways that kind of would have been practiced with the commons. If we as all our people were going to the river to get our water, to do our things, we all know this doesn't belong to any of us. This we have a responsibility to steward this as a community. So, and how, a phrase that has still lingered in our English is the tragedy of the commons.
Yeah.
How would you respond to what's contained in that idea of the tragedy of the commons? That if something's in common, if it's not privatized, that it will just necessarily go to waste, go to crap.
David, that's a great question. I mean, the tragedy of the commons is always this kind of like counterpoint that's brought up. And I think actually a lot of people first learn about the commons through the idea of the tragedy of the commons, right? So the idea of the tragedy of the commons first was popularized in 1968. There's a biology writer by the last name Hardin who published a piece in Science, which is a very well-known general scientific research magazine. And he published this as a paper which essentially described this thing that he called the tragedy of the commons. And he gave the story of kind of a fishing pond that was overfished because all of the individual fishermen were individually, based on this kind of like individual, selfish calculating model that economics has of like the human person. So everybody's trying to, maximize their own income and minimize their own costs and so on. So everybody is, in the short term, incentivized to overfish because it doesn't cost you anything to overfish. But when everybody does that, then the kind of the fish stock collapses, and then suddenly the pond isn't producing any more fish. So this is what he calls the tragedy of the commons. He says, the issue with this is that everybody's incentivized under the current system to take advantage of this common resource. And in so doing, it's not sustainable, it falls apart. The only answer is more or less to privatize things. And everybody needs to be, in the possession of their little bit of private property. And only then are you really incentivized to kind of take care of it and to preserve it for the long term. But a couple issues with this. Number one, people don't always treat their private property very well. And they don't treat their private property with a view to the greater good either. Another issue is the idea of the person that's involved in this. It's this very economically calculating rational, quote unquote, rational individual who's based on this kind of selfish model. But there was a researcher 50 years after Hardin named Eleanor Alstrom who won a Nobel Prize in economics for this work. First woman to do so. I think this was 2009. And she actually went around the world finding examples of the commons. And there are tons of them. And she found there's no tragedy of the commons. There's a tragedy of the unmanaged commons. So yes, if you allow people to just abuse this common resource, of course it's going to happen. But through a series of social agreement, social pressure, exclusion for people who break the rules, gradated punishments for people. But again, that even makes it sound more formal than it is. A lot of times it's a very kind of socially held community project to steward the commons. Then the tragedy of the commons doesn't happen. It's pretty much a fiction. And Hardin himself, decades later, came out and says, you're right. I was wrong about it. There's no tragedy of the commons. It's the tragedy of the unmanaged commons. So I just take that to just say that there's a ton of potential still in the commons. And it's something that's a live option in the past as well as Oh, sorry. Can I just say one more thing too? And to go back a little bit, I was meaning to throw this in and got distracted in this wonderful conversation. But you made a really interesting point about the agency and power that individual people have in this system, because people who want to kind of emphasize the individual potential of people tend to go more on the private side. They say, you can amass as much money as you can, have all this initiative. And then people who want to emphasize maybe, let's say, the social responsibility end up more on the public side and say we should have let's say, a stronger state, a more distributive state. But that assumes that in the commons, people don't really have, like, there's no way to square this and have both community responsibility and individual agency. But that's exactly what the commons provides. So every year in these old villages, you gave the really wonderful example of like a public park where the big landowner on the corner of the park starts to, extend the fence and build an addition or extend their lawn or something. So every year, and this was also kind of based on a liturgical year because there'd be a feast afterwards, but the villagers would do something called beating the bounds, where they would walk around the edges of every common that they had in the village, and they would point out to their kids, here's where the stone was last year, here's where it is this year, okay, this one's in the same place. Oh, look, somebody moved the boundary stone this year, like, we're going to move it back. And there was a whole crowd of, like, all the villagers, so, like, they just moved it back, and they all knew, like, no enclosure this year. So there's a whole tradition of, like, intense kind of community responsibility and stewardship and protection that goes into this.
So I found the Westminster Larger Catechism question.
Yes.
It is, what are the sins forbidden in the 8th commandment? And the 8th commandment is the thou shalt not steal.
Do not steal.
And connecting to what you were just saying, another thing that it lists is removing landmarks. Is these,
Ooh, yes, exactly. That's it.
Because there are marks between different properties, and that's not just between private properties and landmarking your family's land and my family's land, but it's also common land. And then the other one is, unjust enclosures.
Love
so
that.
for anybody in the Reformed world, go and check it out.
And I would love to see, a modern movement of like beating the bounds. Like, what are our current commons that are being kind of co-opted and privatized for private wealth? I think a big one, this would be an easy example, but like we have this mental commons. That's our like kind of collective mental life together, language, attention, tradition, memory, all these things. But when you see an advertisement, when you see a billboard on the side of the road, or those like terrible little video advertisements now in the gas stations, when you're trying to fill your car with gas and the video advertisements pop up, like those are a direct enclosure of our attention, right? And somebody's making money off that somewhere. But it's like, it's very distressing to like get these messages all the time. And so I think some version of a modern beating the bounds would be like going around and taking down obnoxious advertisements as like a huge group of people. And like, that could happen. We could do that. And like kind of resetting the norms of like, what kind of life do we want to have together? I don't want a life that I'm like constantly bombarded by advertisements.
Man, if only we lived in Vermont where they didn't have billboards, but they probably still have gas station bombardments.
In Hawaii.
Hawaii too?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Yep. There's a couple states.
So I didn't include into your introduction. I think I can now call you Dr. D. Brendan Johnson.
Oh, next week.
Okay. By the time this is released, I can accurately call Brendan Dr. Brendan Johnson. And that is specifically in the field of psychiatry. So I don't know if you have any more on the kind of mental commons, how you think about that as a doctor in psychiatry.
I think we could have a whole nother episode about that. But I think, you see these broader social trends. A recent study came out that said teenage girls, like 57% of them feel persistently hopeless. And for boys, it's a little bit lower, but both numbers have gone up by like 50% in the last 10 years. And those were higher than the decade before. So there's just this huge increase in like distress, anxiety, depression. And I think, thankfully we have less stigma about this, but maybe there's also less stigma because like everybody's experiencing some level of this. And it's just kind of something in the water these days. And we don't really, in psychiatry also, we don't really have a good explanation of why this is happening, because it's not like our DNA is changing that fast. And even like medications, they haven't really changed very much for anxiety and depression in the last decade or two. So like, where is this coming from? It seems pretty clear to me that this is like some sort of social pathology that's like causing an increasing amount of distress. And it's not even just kind of the clinical anxiety and depression, which are pretty well-defined, clinical entities, but also just this strange kind of like, we're not okay. Like life is not okay. Things are bad. Things are not improving. People don't feel like they have a positive view towards the future. And I think that a lot of this can be described as essentially like a breakdown in the mental commons. And again, advertisements is one part. TikTok is another part. Instagram, but there's many things too, like even the huge amount of student debt. It's this just like mental load on the back of your mind. And student debt is a great example of the lenders are getting, huge returns on offering loans to students. Whereas if we had a system where that was like paid on the front end and students rather just like paid in taxes or something instead of loans, people just feel so much more freedom and like you graduate debt free, and you'd have this like desire to contribute to the rest of society later on in funding like your children or the next generation's educations. But instead we have this like weird system of loans, and you pay back and you kind of feel resentful and angry about the whole thing. That's kind of another breakdown of the mental commons.
So I want to hit on this desire to contribute. It's connected, we talk about agency of like, if people actually have access to the resources that they need, like it's actually equipping their agency. But there's also this desire to contribute. And we are in an economic model and culture that assumes that people will only do things if it immediately and almost only benefits themselves. I think about us living in an intentional Christian community, we are building something that's not just about our ownership, that it's not, you're going to be moving out soon. By the time this is released, you'll probably have been moved out. And yet you decided to come and contribute to this thing that we're holding in very small common ownership. And I think about, if we can use the dishwasher as an example, you had a lot of joy figuring out how to get the new used dishwasher into our kitchen.
Mostly because I have to wash less dishes.
So that's what I'm wondering. How much of it is just like for the, extra month that I'm here, I'm just thrilled to have the dishwasher be used, and how much, which is totally like fine and appropriate. And if it's just that, maybe we'll cut it out of the podcast. But is there a component that you're like, if you were to come back a year later, you'd be like, oh, the dishwasher I helped installed is still being used by the community?
Yeah. No, there's these two philosophers who I really love, Michael Hart and Tony Negri, and they wrote a book called Commonwealth that actually talks about this kind of like modern, how do we do common stuff today, right? And they talk about this basis of joy as the basis of the commons. And they say like, the commons is where we find joy. And you can imagine from all the examples that we've discussed, like commons are joyful places. And also like you want to contribute to the joy. And so we need to pay attention, I think, to the things that bring us joy, the place that we find joy, the place that we have joy in contributing. And I think that just empirically, we find that people get joy from like contributing to others' well-being and to flourishing and to like beautiful projects that we're doing together. Like that's when people really come alive. I mean, again, what like Wikipedia makes no sense from a financial model, right? People are putting in all this unpaid work, and it doesn't make any sense. But like they're doing it for the joy of it, and we all derive joy from participating. And so in the same thing, I think just empirically, like it's a joy to contribute to community projects, and also it's a joy to draw on them. And I just wish that more parts of our lives were not mediated through money, but like we're mediated through commons. And I think also there's a question of like formation. I think people don't, and I would count myself in this category before learning about all of this too, but like we pretty much as modern people don't even have the language to describe the commons and this kind of joy that's part of it. But also, the kind of economist model of like the homo economicus, right? The rational man who's always a man and who's always rational and who's always, a very just kind of like biological calculator more or less of how many units of utility or, pleasure can I get out of this? And like, that's just a really stunted model of what it means to be human. And I think that if we have a culture that's based on that presupposition, we're going to build people like that. And then our entire lives are going to be based on that. And that's going to make us all really sad and mad. And I think if we have a much more, lively and full and complex and creaturely account of like the fullness of what it means to be a human, created in the image of God, created to be in communion with all of creation and with one another, like that really pushes us towards a bigger vision that allows us to like imagine the goods that come from actions in and towards the commons, and kind of like not towards just economic success in a very narrow way. Of course, the commons are also where all of wealth is produced from, right? Like natural and kind of social commons. It's like you can't make any money if you like don't know how to speak, and you learn to speak through the commons. So, like true economic flourishing and true creaturely flourishing is in the commons, but we have this weird kind of narrowness of vision in our modern culture that's just like so focused on dollars and cents that it really stunts our entire vision of what being human even means.
Yeah, we only have a few minutes left, and so what you just said there even makes me think about elements, just of what it means to be human, and some of the ways that we see of how that's expressed, of how do humans find flourishing and joy in like city design, is that people, like this is in park design or in kind of more city space where people might be like sitting around, they want to be a part of something in kind of a safe way.
Yes.
And, like whether it's the person who just sits on a bench and is able to just look at other people like living life and having joy, and that improves the mental health, the well-being that they're experiencing being part of something, finding a sense of belonging without having to actually have the most intimate belonging of these like intimate relationships where like I know all their names. And I feel like because we're in this individualized culture where it's like we don't talk to people until we, are doing until we sit down for coffee with them. And we don't have any of this larger group belonging that is actually really important to how God made us. That in a class I'm taking right now, that the like man in the image of God in some ways can be thought of as, mankind, human society is in the image of God, because immediately man is male and female with the call to multiply. And the only time when man is an individual, God says, this is not good. It's the only time in the creation story where something is said, this is not good, is man as an individual. And yet we try to analyze and think of ourselves as individuals, and so when we're like, oh, is this just are we just tacking on psychology and giving it a faith spin? But like particularly in Genesis 1, to be human, it is good, it is flourishing, it's fruitful for there to be a togetherness, and that is experienced in I think it's supposed to be actually quite mundane and just quite normal ways that we step out. And one of our neighbors was a middle school gal, was just cleaning up trash this afternoon and taking care of our kind of common space. And that just brings so much joy of like, oh yeah, we're contributing to this space together. We do trash pickups together to make our neighborhood more beautiful.
Yeah, that's right. And even I love what you said too about the rooting of kind of our togetherness in Genesis and in God's vision. And I think even look through the New Testament and look even into Revelation and our eschatology. Like, it's interesting that we use the word communion to describe like the paradigmatic Christian activity, and like we desire to be in communion with one another through a very embodied and spiritual way, right? And we practice this weekly. And then this should flow over into our social lives, into our economic lives, like through cooperatives and all of this. But so there's this kind of horizontal social communion, and then there's also the vertical communion with God. And I think that it's no surprise that our greatest longings for full communion with God and with creation and with one another is like the deepest heartthrob of Christian desire for the new heavens and the new earth, and like the kingdom of God that's breaking in every day. And the fact that we get to practice communion in a small way every week is just like a beautiful foretaste of that, right? And we get to practice the imagination, practice the cultivation of our vision and activity. And this is like a kingdom of peace, right? Like you reconcile with one another before you come together. And then you give the sign of peace afterwards. And then again, you're breaking bread, right? In the name of the King of Peace. Like it's a very beautiful vision. And I don't know exactly how the term common and communion relate, especially with that kind of horizontal and spiritual, but I think that there's at least a very poetic connection there.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's a link at just this past Sunday. I helped get back our common cup back into the communion. During COVID, we got rid of all the common cups and just went to the individual communion cups and instead of these goblets that we would have, and made it available. Just we have two communion lines, and after the service, this one family was like, I'm so glad the common cup has returned. And we can think of that as, it's just different people's aesthetic preferences, or those people, for some reason, like the germs of other people that might be shared. But there is a tangible reality of what's being expressed, that we share in the same Jesus. When we drink from this common cup, it's in this cup that we become one people. And
Yes.
It's
in this cup that we get our life.
Yeah.
Right? And the same thing. I mean, again, think about the 3M example. It's like we're all drinking from the same earth, right? And we all get our water from the earth, and like that can be poisoned. And we drink from like our fates are bound up in one another, and we drink from the same cup with the same source of life that we recognize.
Yeah.
I was going to say one more thing that I just love about your church, David Frank, is like at the very end, when communion is done, everybody filters up to the front, and it's kind of a traditional pew and altar or the pulpit with the pastor preaches from. But then at the very end, everybody goes up, filters through, takes their communion, and then stands in a circle around the very edge. And then everybody sings the doxology together, facing one another, seeing the faces of the entire church all at once. And I absolutely love that, because it is kind of a reminder that like church is not a lecture, it's not a concert, it's not like a merely kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, like spectator event, right? But it's really this thing we're doing together. And like you see the faces of the community, and then inevitably you're standing next to somebody you haven't spoken to in a while, so you start to chat at the end of the service. And I just love that as a way of kind of like institutionalizing, or not institutionalizing, but like setting a cultural norm and an expectation and an invitation for kind of the beauty of community life.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been so thankful for it. Could you give us any, like we can never in any of these things rewind in time and just like reinstitute the common forest in our local area that we, most of us haven't even dwelled in an area for more than a generation. What are opportunities? You mentioned, we could be contributors to Wikipedia. All right. Do you see other opportunities for us to start to redevelop a sense of the commons or specific commons in our lives and communities?
Yeah, I think the first one, again, is just have the vision and the imagination for like naming it and recognizing it. And then second one is to say, what are the needs that you have, right? And how can you decommodify and put into the commons exactly those needs? And so, as you were saying, the way that we live together here, we kind of try to live as a form of a cooperative or a commonwealth, where it's not that somebody's just, you as the person who's on the mortgage, like aren't just getting rich at the expense of all of us, but it's this like project that we kind of have a certain financial arrangement that allows our collective flourishing together. And also the flourishing of the neighborhood, right? But also there's many other examples. One that I just love is the kind of like economics of commoning. And I mentioned Wikipedia, we mentioned the land use examples. But one way that people have tried to do this in their kind of work lives, let's say, is through the form of cooperatively owned businesses. So instead of having a business that's like owned by, let's say, kind of a private single business owner who just owns the business and hires employees, right? And also another option, like a publicly traded share company that's just determined by the board, who themselves are voted on by the shareholders, who are only interested in profit, right? Because this is the structure of like a shareholder-owned company. And both of those, like the employees, are still just employees, and they're still just being told what to do. And the kind of direction of this whole thing is either towards profit alone, or maybe you have like a really nice boss if there's like a single owner of the company who is kind of benevolent, right? But that's kind of the best case scenario. But there's tons of examples, multi-billion-dollar companies across the world that are owned by the employees. And so it's this beautiful example that like you actually get to vote on your boss and you get to vote on the direction of the company. There's one famous example out of the UK called the Scott Bader Company. And they just said, you know what, we don't want to contribute to the war industry. So we're like not going to sell any of our products to the war industry. And half of the profit we keep as the employees, half of the profit we give to the community through charity. And like we vote on where we send it. So there's like beautiful forms of economic commoning, as it were.
Which has such a difference from, I know people who work at Tesla, where it's like, oh, Elon Musk is coming in and he might, as owner, just come walk down, see somebody who he thinks isn't working good enough and just fire them on the spot.
Yep.
And because this business serves him.
Yep.
or shareholders more broadly, rather than this being our work. And if we see someone slacking off, then we work together to like address that so
Yes.
that we can all continue flourishing together, including that person who's slacking off.
Yeah. It's a much more human form. Like we're not just waiting for the axe from somebody or the blessing. It's like, no, we're like creating this thing together. And like I have a vote. Economic democracy, right? And how can we have a political democracy if we're not practicing democracy in our lives as well?
And the basic economic practices every day.
And if you're being told every day what to do, and you're just like simply being like regurgitated instructions, and your only role is like a tool that like eats and breathes, like that is a less than human existence, and we should be right as humans to like revolt against an economic model in which that is true. But we want to be full humans, like at work, in politics, in our families, with our friends, out in the city, right? And all of these are like, we need to say, what would it look like to be able to be fully human in these spaces? I don't want to be told what to do at work, except by a boss who I vote on. And that's a real thing. Like we could have a system like that. We just don't, but we could. And there's lots of barriers to get there, but I think that it would not be as hard as we think it would.
So for people who want to learn more, I think one thing they could look into the economic philosophy that you had described right at the beginning of, like, oh, there's this land and it was distributed. They could look into distributism, which is something especially thinkers like G.K. Chesterton, or what they were supporting as kind of the Christian economic philosophy as an alternative to neoliberal capitalism. What would be would there be any specific resources, books or podcasts that you might recommend?
Yeah, so there's one podcast called Frontiers of Commoning. That's really good. There's a guy, David Bollier.
We'll link to it.
Yeah, Bollier, who has some really good stuff. He also just came out with a book called Free, Fair, and Alive. That's about how do you do commons, like what is the kind of like deep structure of commoning, especially and gives a ton of examples. It's a nice thing. Another one, there's in the U.S. in Jackson, Mississippi, there's something called Jackson Rising, which is a majority black-owned cooperative network that's essentially saying, like, how can we have uplift of our communities in kind of a personal, communal, economic, spiritual sense? Well, economic democracy, cooperatives, that's the way to do it. And so that's a beautiful... There's a bunch of books that have come out about that, as well as you can find things on YouTube. I'm trying to think of honestly, just Googling some of these things can be really helpful. Google Commons history, Google commoning, Google cooperatives. There's a great organization called Mondragon, which looks like Mondragon, and that it comes out of the Basque region in Spain, and it's the largest cooperative on earth that was started, almost 100 years ago by a Catholic priest. And there's just, you could keep following Wikipedia links.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson, for this fun exploration into life of the commons. I hope that it piques some interest and expands curiosity for the common life that we can all seek to be building in our local communities.
Amen.
Y'all have a good day, and I'll see you soon. Hey listeners, I want to let you know about the Communion and Shalom Patreon. joining the Patreon community not only supports this podcast, but gives you the opportunity to listen to bonus content, give input on future episodes, and submit questions for a patron-only Q&A. We're so thankful for the support and encouragement from so many listeners, and we hope that this podcast continues to be meaningful to you.